Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about something way grimier than lace gloves and polite morning calls, the medieval tavern. Trust me, if you think your local dive bar is sketchy, you haven't seen anything yet. These places were the beating, booze-soaked heart of medieval life. But behind the songs and laughter were filth, disease, violence, and desperation that make the modern idea of slumming it look like a spa weekend. If you're tuning in from bed right now, lights dim, ready to drift off, just know people once fell asleep in rooms above taverns where the straw mattresses were so alive with fleas and lice that scratching yourself bloody was part of the bedtime routine. Oh, and if you're enjoying this dive into the past, a like or a subscribe really helps. I'm curious where you're all listening from tonight. Drop me a comment with your location, because it blows my mind thinking about people falling asleep to these stories all over the world. Alright, let's step back, far back, into the late Middle Ages. Imagine this. You've been walking for miles down muddy roads, boots caked in muck, stomach growling, the smell of dung and smoke clinging to everything. Up ahead you see the flicker of firelight through warped shutters. A crude sign with a painted tankard creaks in the wind. That's your destination, the tavern, the so-called welcome of medieval hospitality. You push open the door, and instantly you're swallowed by a wall of smells, sounds, and sights that'll make you question whether you've just walked into a refuge or straight into hell. Step through the splintered wooden door of a medieval tavern, and the first thing that hits you isn't the warmth of welcome or the cheerful clinking of mugs, but a wave of smells so dense and suffocating they feel like a physical wall pressing against your chest. It's the stink of stale ale soaked into the very timbers of the floorboards, of sweat so thick in the air it mingles with the reek of damp wool cloaks, of fire smoke curling low from a poorly vented hearth, of unwashed bodies crammed shoulder to shoulder in a room with no notion of hygiene, and beneath it all, the metallic tang of blood from a pig slaughtered earlier in the day and hacked apart on the same table, now used for dice games, a place where sanitation and consumption, work and pleasure, death and life blur into one choking fugue. It isn't just the air that assaults you, it's the soundscape too. A roar of voices, every accent of Christendom jumbled together, Norman French mixed with Saxon curses, guttural German merchants arguing about grain shipments, the high-pitched laughter of prostitutes luring farmhands toward shadowed corners, and always, always the rhythmic banging of tankards on wood, demanding more ale, the medieval equivalent of today's impatient honking car horns, creating a percussion of need and violence that never stops until the tavern keeper, red-faced and harried, either gives in with another jug or slams the door in someone's face. Picture this. The average tavern in 14th century England might cram 60 people into a room meant for 20, and since records suggest that in London alone there were over 1,300 alehouses by the year 1300, one for roughly every 40 inhabitants, it means that entire neighborhoods lived inside a constant cycle of drinking, shouting, fighting, and collapsing in ditches outside. It was an entire economy of intoxication where ale wasn't just a leisure drink, but often safer than the water, though safer is a relative word because the brew itself was frequently contaminated, sour, or deliberately watered down to stretch profits, and the bitterness of wormwood or bog myrtle was added not out of craft, but to disguise rot. Sit at one of the heavy, uneven trestle tables, and your elbows will stick to the wood, not from polish, but from generations of spilled drink, grease, candle wax, and the dried traces of vomit that no one ever fully scrubbed away, because soap was expensive and water hauling a misery, and besides, after the first few mugs, no one cared. This is where peasants and knights alike might slouch together, a place where rigid social hierarchies softened in the haze of alcohol. But don't be fooled. The truce lasted only as long as the drink flowed, and one wrong word about a land dispute or a noble's honor could end with a knife flashing in the firelight, the scrape of steel against pewter, a scream cut short, and the innkeeper muttering, "Not again," as another body was dragged out into the mud to be found stiff in the morning. Every surface of this place tells you a story. The low ceiling blackened with soot from centuries of open fires, dripping tar-like residue onto anyone unlucky enough to sit beneath the rafters. The rushes scattered on the floor, meant to absorb spittle, beer, and worse, but quickly fermenting into their own living ecosystem of lice, fleas, and the occasional rat, bold enough to scurry between boots. The benches sagging under the weight of men who haven't bathed in weeks, their hair crusted with ash, and their breath sharp with garlic and rotting teeth, leaning in close to shout gossip about the Black Death, 2 towns over, or the latest scandal in the bishop's court, while somewhere in the background a dog fights a goose brought inside as a traveler's gift, feathers exploding into the fire glow as drunken laughter rises. Then there's the food, if you dare call it that, trenchers of coarse black bread, so stale it could break teeth, stews made from whatever scraps hadn't spoiled yet, heavily salted to hide decay, cuts of meat that might be goat or might be dog, few could tell, fewer cared, all washed down with ale, so thick with floating sediment that chroniclers wrote of men shoveling yeast out of their cups with spoons, yet still they drank, because in a world where dysentery from bad water killed thousands each year, the tavern's foul brew was considered the lesser evil. Look around more carefully, and you notice the dangers layered beneath the laughter, eyes watching you too intently from the dim corners, where conspirators whisper about smuggling wool or plotting against the sheriff, a cut purse bumping deliberately into a drunken merchant, relieving him of his coin purse before he even realizes it's gone, a girl no more than 12, carrying mugs twice her size, weaving between groping hands, her face already hardened into the mask of someone who knows the game of survival too well. The tavern isn't just a place to drink, it's a theater of desperation, a crucible where plague meets prayer, hunger meets gluttony, lust meets violence, and where the very walls seem to sweat with the memory of centuries of sin. Even the architecture conspires against you. Windows no larger than arrow slits let in little light, the air inside always damp and heavy, floors warped so badly you stumble even before the drink unsteadies you, and the smell of mold rising from cellars where barrels leak into earth already saturated with centuries of spills. If you linger long enough, your throat burns from the smoke and your eyes water from the stench, yet you cannot leave, because here is where news travels, where kings are cursed by name in voices too drunk to remember discretion, where mercenaries brag about campaigns in Flanders, where friars are mocked behind their backs, and where every dangerous rumor that will shape the next rebellion is born over a dirty mug of ale. To stand inside a medieval tavern is to stand inside the beating, diseased heart of the Middle Ages itself, intoxicating, terrifying, and utterly inescapable. You stay inside longer now, past that first dizzying sensory assault, and you begin to see that the tavern isn't just a pit of noise and ale, but an entire ecosystem of survival and exploitation, a machine that grinds everyone who enters down into fuel for its own chaos. In one corner, you spot a group of men huddled around a board scratched crudely into the table, playing dice carved from animal bone, the cubes worn smooth by countless throws, and every roll followed by curses that spit flecks of phlegm and tooth fragments across the wood. Gambling here is more than diversion, it's lifeblood, with peasants staking their week's wages and soldiers betting their weapons. A kind of desperation economy where fortunes flip on the clatter of dice, and when fortunes sour, fists fly, daggers flash, and sometimes the losers never leave. Their corpses quietly hauled out back and dumped in middens where dogs gnaw their bones. Behind them, half shrouded by smoke, a crooked stair leads to a loft filled with straw pallets, advertised as beds, but crawling with lice, fleas, and worse. For a few extra pennies you can rent one for the night. Though rent is generous, what you're buying is the privilege of waking covered in bites, scratching yourself raw, while bedfellows grunt, groan, 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 and sometimes scream from fevers that everyone pretends aren't plague, but that too often spread through these upper rooms like wildfire. Records from city courts in the 14th century describe outbreaks traced directly to taverns, where travelers shared not only ale, but sickness, where prostitutes became unknowing vectors of syphilis long before physicians had a name for it, and where diarrhea, vomiting, and coughing fits formed a kind of background music to the drunken songs rising from below. At the back, where candlelight barely reaches, there are darker dealings still. Smuggling contracts whispered over parchment, forged seals traded like currency, bandits offering stolen goods to eager buyers, and sometimes rebels conspiring, for it was in taverns that England's 1381 Peasants' Revolt was whispered into existence, where common men, emboldened by drink, dared to imagine confronting lords and kings. So each laugh you hear might be the start of treason, each muttered toast a spark that could burn a city. Presiding over it all, the tavern keeper, equal parts entrepreneur and warlord, a figure who knows everyone's secrets, who waters the ale and pockets the profit, who rents out his daughter to drunks in backrooms, who feeds stale bread to paying guests while keeping the fresh loaves for himself, who turns a blind eye to theft as long as he gets his cut. He is both gatekeeper and parasite, keeping the wheels of the place turning while bleeding every soul who enters, and yet, paradoxically, he's also the closest thing this world has to a community leader, for he provides what peasants crave most, not comfort, not safety, but escape, however brief, from the mud-choked fields, the endless taxes, the sermons promising hellfire. Look into his eyes, red-rimmed and rheumy, and you realize he is the tavern incarnate, a man consumed by the same rot he sells, his teeth blackened, his fingernails clogged with grime, his voice hoarse from shouting over the roar, but his smile sharp when a coin changes hands. Everywhere you turn, the tavern closes tighter around you, oppressive, airless, each draught of ale binding you to the place as surely as iron shackles, until the thought creeps in that perhaps no one truly leaves here unchanged. Some stagger out poorer, others infected, some carried out cold and stiff, their eyes glassy, but all marked by the tavern's grip, all bearing invisible scars of nights spent drowning in its firelit darkness. The deeper the night grows, the more the tavern mutates into something monstrous, as if the building itself feeds on darkness, swallowing what little civility the daylight had permitted, until the air is no longer just thick with smoke and sweat, but heavy with menace, a living fog of desperation that clings to your skin like oil. The laughter that earlier sounded rough but harmless now takes on a jagged edge, turning into the manic giggles of men who've drunk themselves into oblivion, their joy indistinguishable from madness, while others slump forward, drooling into their mugs, eyes rolling like oxen before slaughter, and you realize with a chill that this is no place for weakness. Predators circle here, human wolves sniffing out those too far gone to defend their purses, their bodies, or their lives. In the farthest corner, lit only by the guttering stub of a tallow candle, a girl barely out of childhood drapes herself over a soldier whose chainmail still reeks of sweat and blood, her face caked with powder to disguise the pallor of malnutrition, her smile stretched tight enough to crack, and you understand this isn't flirtation but negotiation, a transaction of flesh for coin, a ritual repeated endlessly in taverns across medieval Europe. Prostitution was not just tolerated, but woven into the very fabric of these places, with city records from Paris in the 13th century listing taverns as officially designated brothels, taxed by the crown, blessed in silence by priests who themselves drank and lingered after hours. So, behind every toast to God and King, there is a barter for bodies, a deal struck in whispers, and if the girl grows ill, if she coughs blood onto a soldier's chest, or develops lesions too obvious to ignore, she is discarded, like spoiled meat, replaced by another desperate soul from the countryside, drawn into the tavern's black gravity. Over near the hearth, where the flames hiss and spit, a group of gamblers argue over a dice throw, their faces distorted in firelight, and one produces a dagger so quickly it seems conjured from the smoke itself. There is no shock, no scream from the crowd, only a ripple of interest, for violence here is as common as spilled ale, and the tavern is both arena and judge, with disputes settled not by law, but by who bleeds fastest, and the innkeeper already knows that come dawn he'll scrub, or rather smear, the blood deeper into the rushes, covering it with fresh straw, the cycle repeating with mechanical inevitability. Every object in the room seems complicit, the mugs chipped not by accident, but by being smashed into skulls, the stools missing legs from being wielded as weapons, the walls scarred with gouges from blades drawn in rage. Even the ale itself, cloudy and sour, isn't merely a drink but an accomplice, loosening tongues until confessions pour forth. A man admits to stealing grain, another boasts of evading the tax collector, another whispers about meeting rebels beyond the town walls, secrets that in sober light would cost lives, yet here flow like sewage, polluting the air. Above it all hangs the invisible specter of disease, the great shadow that defines the Middle Ages, for taverns were breeding grounds of pestilence. Studies of medieval skeletons show that malnutrition and parasites were rampant, and taverns were ideal transmission points, with lice jumping freely between cloaks hung too close, rats bold enough to snatch crumbs off tables, fleas carrying plague from traveler to traveler, until half a continent lay dead. To drink here is to roll dice with fate, and the more you stare at the faces around you, slack-jawed farmers, scarred mercenaries, pockmarked whores, shifty-eyed merchants, the more you sense that the tavern is less a building than a mouth, swallowing humanity whole and spitting out only bones. This is not refuge, not fellowship, not the romantic inn of modern fantasy. This is a crucible of rot and rage, the boiling pit where medieval society reveals its ugliest truths, and the longer you remain, the more you wonder whether the truly damned are in hell below or gathered right here above in the firelit stench of the tavern, raising their mugs in mockery of salvation. If you remain in that reeking den long enough, you'll start to perceive how the tavern is not just an isolated cesspool, but a reflection of the entire medieval world, compressed into one choking room, a dark mirror of society, where all the contradictions of the age bleed together into a single foul broth. Here, in this one building, you'll see how hunger, lust, poverty, power, faith, and death collide, and the spectacle is grotesque in its honesty. Consider the ale itself, the lifeblood of the tavern. By the year 1300, chroniclers estimated that in England alone, the average adult consumed between 1 to 1.5 gallons of weak ale per day, not out of love for drunkenness, but because water drawn from streams or shallow wells was so frequently contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, or tannery runoff that drinking it raw was practically a death sentence. Yet the tavern keeper, ever eager to squeeze an extra penny, watered down even this safe ale until it was little more than sour, cloudy sludge, sometimes adding chalk dust to give it body or herbs like tansy to mask the taste of rot. Customers knew they were being cheated, but they still drank, because thirst was more immediate than justice, and besides, tavern law was slippery. Medieval authorities often tried to regulate alehouses, forcing them to display ale stakes, wooden poles hung outside to show that drink was sold within, and to measure cups properly, but inspectors were few, bribes common, and punishments mild, so the cheating continued endlessly. Yet the drink was the least of it. Look to the food, and you'll see something even more disturbing. Plates of salted fish left out for days, crawling with flies, hunks of mutton hacked from diseased sheep and boiled until the stench dulled enough to pass, pies filled with pigeon one week and crow the next, and bread bulked with ground acorns when grain was scarce. Forensic archaeology on medieval cesspits has confirmed the sheer range of contamination in diets, with parasites like whipworm and roundworm present in staggering numbers, meaning every bite you take here likely delivers a payload of infection. But nobody pauses, because this is normal. The tavern doesn't just tolerate sickness, it incubates it, and when plague years come, like the Black Death of 1347 to 1351, these rooms become accelerants of death, where fleas jump from one drinker's ankle to another's, where coughing spreads through a crowd packed too tightly to breathe, where men drink harder precisely because the world outside is ending, and if they are to die tomorrow, then better to die tonight with a mug in hand. In this swirl of ale and pestilence, other forces stalk the shadows, spies for the crown, listening for seditious talk, clerics hunting heresy, bailiffs noting who owes debts, cutthroats waiting for a nod from their masters, and whores whispering false affection to men who will wake in the morning with lighter purses, emptier bellies, and sometimes sores that will never heal. The tavern is simultaneously the most public and most secretive place in the village. Public because anyone can stumble in, secretive because within its smoky walls you can say what you'd never risk in daylight, and so it becomes the true parliament of the poor, where rebellion ferments alongside beer, where gossip travels faster than church sermons, where reputations are made and destroyed in the time it takes to slam a cup on a table. When you think about it, that's the most disturbing truth of all. Not the filth, not the rats, not even the death, but the fact that people needed these places, flocked to them, built their lives around them, because for all the suffering they caused, Taverns offered the one commodity rarer than gold in the medieval world: escape, a fleeting lie of freedom that people willingly swallowed even as it poisoned them. Stay into the late hours, and you'll witness how the tavern mutates from chaotic drinking hall into something darker, something resembling both a court and a brothel, both a marketplace and a battlefield, its functions bleeding into one another so seamlessly that you realize the tavern isn't just tolerated by medieval society, it is medieval society in miniature, a place where every hidden truth of the age rises to the surface. Violence is the most predictable currency here, as regular as the serving of ale. Disputes over dice, insults about lineage, or accusations of watered drink erupt into savage brawls where fists, tankards, and knives all find equal use, and the innkeeper knows better than to intervene, for he risks becoming the next corpse on the rush-covered floor. So he lets the mob settle its own justice, dragging the loser into the street to bleed out in the mud, while the victors return to their mugs as if nothing had happened. Records from the coroner's rolls of London show that a staggering number of murders between the 13th and 15th centuries took place in or around taverns, so frequent that ballads and sermons both warned, "The alehouse is the road to hell." But the road was always crowded, because along with violence came pleasures too illicit to find elsewhere. In the shadowy corners of every tavern, prostitutes negotiated their trade, some seasoned women hardened by years of exploitation, others frighteningly young, sold by desperate families or abducted by pimps who prowled the highways. Upstairs in flea-ridden lofts, the groans of coupling echoed through thin planks, mingling with the sound of snoring, coughing, or the creak of beams as dozens of strangers shared the same suffocating space. Church councils railed against taverns as nests of fornication, and yet many a priest could be found drinking in them, their tonsures hidden beneath hoods, buying the very sins they condemned from the pulpit. Hypocrisy became just another flavor in the stew of corruption. It wasn't only flesh that changed hands, information did too, and that made taverns dangerous in ways more subtle than daggers and disease. In smoky back rooms, men whispered treason, peasants plotting revolts against landlords, mercenaries promising their blades to whoever paid most, merchants conspiring to fix grain prices. Some historians argue that no medieval rebellion, from the Jacquerie in France to the English peasants' revolt, could have spread without taverns acting as rumor mills, where discontent fermented faster than ale. Authorities knew this, and so taverns became both indispensable and feared. Indispensable because they were the only places where travelers could lodge, where soldiers could be recruited, where messages could be spread. Feared because they were also incubators of sedition, dens where loyalty to crown and church dissolved in a haze of alcohol. This is why taverns were taxed mercilessly, licensed under strict codes, and periodically raided by sheriffs, but never eradicated, because too many elites themselves depended on them. So, in the end, the tavern became a paradox, outlawed in sermons, regulated in statutes, cursed by parents, yet always full, always alive, always throbbing with humanity's ugliest hungers. Stand in that firelight long enough, and you realize the tavern is not just disturbing because it's filthy or violent. It's disturbing because it strips away every pretense of civilization, laying bare the medieval soul in all its desperate, hungry, rotting glory. And it whispers the most terrifying truth of all. People didn't stumble into these places by accident. They sought them, they built them, they needed them, and in that need you see a mirror of yourself, because the urge to escape, to indulge, to drown in oblivion is not medieval at all. It's human, eternal, and staring at you through the smoke. Stay in the suffocating dark long enough, and your eyes adjust, but instead of comfort, you're greeted with horror, because what you see isn't just drunkenness or filth, it's disease embodied, crawling, breeding, and spreading through every surface, every body, every breath of that place. Imagine the straw mattresses upstairs, damp with sweat and urine, never changed, rarely aired out, stuffed with whatever husks or rushes were available. Dig into them, and you'd unleash armies of fleas and lice, those tiny tormentors that carried plague across Europe, the same plague that in the span of 4 years, 1347 to 1351, annihilated between 30 and 60% of the continent's population. And historians note that taverns were perfect accelerants, places where travelers from different villages mixed, slept close, shared mugs and trenchers, coughed into each other's faces, each tavern a potential ground zero. Archaeologists have sifted medieval cesspits near old inns and found parasite eggs in staggering numbers: whipworm, roundworm, tapeworm, liver fluke, even head lice combs tossed away like broken tools. Evidence that every bite of stew and every sip of ale likely carried microscopic passengers destined to coil through intestines and gnaw at the body from within. Dysentery, called the bloody flux, haunted every drinker. Diarrhea could last for weeks, dehydrating victims until they collapsed on the rush-strewn floor, and their death rattles were muffled by the constant din of laughter and song, as if the tavern itself had learned to ignore suffering. The ale was no salvation either, brewed in conditions so unsanitary that whole vats turned rancid, thick with yeast clumps and crawling with insect larvae, yet drunk anyway because the alternative, water from a ditch, was worse. Chroniclers tell of men vomiting violently after one mug, only to buy another in the hope it would settle the stomach, a cruel cycle that fed the tavern's profit and the gravedigger's trade. Skin diseases too thrived in this miasma: scabies, ringworm, sores that oozed pus and stuck to sleeves. Touch the wrong bench, and you might carry home a rash that burned for months. Yet no one thought of leaving, because where else could they go? The tavern offered companionship, a false refuge, and the chance, however slim, to forget their misery for a night. Physicians, when they were dragged into such places, often left with horror stories of patients whose lungs rotted from the smoky air, whose teeth dissolved from sweetened wine, adulterated with lead acetate, whose bellies swelled with worms until they burst. But for the common man, such risks were the price of belonging. Death was everywhere in the Middle Ages, from war, famine, and plague. So to die in a tavern was no more shameful than to die in a field, and at least here you might die drunk. That was the silent bargain the tavern demanded. Trade your health, your longevity, your very flesh, for one more night of oblivion. As you look around at the coughing, scratching, bleeding bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, you realize the disturbing truth. The tavern wasn't simply a place where disease happened to spread. It was designed by its very structure and used to be a breeding ground for it. A furnace of contagion, feeding endlessly on the weakness of its patrons, a reminder that in the Middle Ages, survival and self-destruction often came from the same mug.